In the autumn of 1904, in the high valleys of western Montana, passers-by saw Arthur Croft doing something that made no sense. He wasn't chinking his cabin walls or splitting extra cordwood. Instead, he was digging. Day after day, with a pick and a shovel, he carved a massive pit into the earth beside his small home. It was deeper than a man was tall and 3 times as long. The community watched. They thought he'd lost his mind. His neighbors were preparing for winter. Arthur Croft was digging a hole. And when the winter of 1905 hit with a 9-day freeze that shattered every record, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between survival and surrender. This isn't just a story about a man digging a cellar. It's a story about a quiet man who understood a single, simple principle of physics that everyone else had forgotten. If you want to hear the number that made the county's most experienced builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet English immigrant understand about heat that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? Before we get to that, if you enjoy stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom, consider subscribing and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Arthur Croft wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 42-year-old former tin miner from Cornwall, a man who had spent 20 years of his life 1,000 feet underground. He and his wife, Eleanor, had come to Montana for the clean air, for a chance to own land they could stand on and see the sky. They had 2 young daughters, Clara and Rose. They had built a solid cabin, by frontier standards more than respectable. It was tight-seamed, with a good stone fireplace and a new cast-iron stove. They thought they were ready. Then their first winter came in 1903, and it was a brutal education. The cold didn't just seep in. It was an active, invading force. Arthur burned through 5 cords of wood before February. He fed the stove every 4 hours, day and night. Still, the cabin never felt truly warm. His daughters slept in their coats, huddled under piles of quilts. Eleanor stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The interior temperature rarely broke 50 degrees. That was on a calm day. When the wind blew, it was a different battle. Arthur watched the fine snow, dry as sand, find its way through invisible cracks in the walls. He felt the drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and he started thinking. He thought not like a carpenter, but like the mine ventilation engineer he'd once been. He understood moving air. He understood the earth itself. Wind doesn't just chill air, it strips heat directly from walls through a process called convection. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees doesn't just feel colder, it pulls BTUS, the actual units of heat, out of solid wood 20 times faster than still air. His neighbors built thicker walls, burned more wood. They were fighting a battle of brute force. Arthur saw a different problem. The problem wasn't just heat loss, it was heat production. His stove was the engine of their survival, and he realized it was fighting an invisible enemy. To burn, a fire needs oxygen. His stove was pulling that oxygen from inside the cabin, and every cubic foot of air it consumed was replaced by a cubic foot of Arctic air pulled in from outside through 100 tiny cracks and gaps. His stove was literally sucking the very cold it was trying to fight directly into their living space. He was heating his home and chilling it with the exact same action. That thought nagged at him all spring. He'd lie awake and feel the ghost of those winter drafts. He remembered the mines back in Cornwall. Deep underground, the temperature was always the same. Summer or winter, 1,000 feet down, the rock held a steady, cool temperature, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't warm, but it was never, ever frozen. The earth itself was a massive, stable reservoir of temperature. His plan formed. It was simple, and, to everyone else, it looked like madness. That summer, he heard the Northern Pacific Railway was auctioning off surplus materials from a washed-out spur line. He rode the wagon 20 miles and came back with a load of huge 12-inch diameter ceramic culvert pipes. He paid $7 for the lot. This was the opportunity. He started digging. He laid out a pit 15 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 10 feet deep, right beside the north wall of his cabin, the wall that took the worst of the winter wind. He dug past the topsoil, past the clay, down into the rocky substrate, until his shovel scraped on stone that had never felt the sun. This was back-breaking work. He was not a young man, but every swing of the pick was driven by the memory of his shivering children. Once the pit was dug, he didn't just start building. First, he laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel for drainage. Moisture was the enemy of any underground structure. Then, using stone he cleared from his own land and a lime mortar he mixed himself, he began to build the walls of his cellar. He wasn't just building a food cellar, he was building an engine, an earth engine. He laid the stone walls thick and tight. He built a vaulted roof, an arch of stone and mortar, a technique he'd learned from the old miners. It was incredibly strong, designed to bear the weight of tons of earth above it. But before he closed it in, he did the two things that made everyone think he was a fool. First, he carefully knocked a hole through his cabin's foundation, right behind the wood stove. He fitted one of the ceramic culvert pipes into the hole, running it from the inside of his cabin into the unfinished cellar. He sealed it tight with mortar. This pipe would be the airway. Second, at the far end of the cellar, 20 feet from the cabin wall, he installed another pipe. This one ran vertically, from the floor of the cellar up through the arched roof, ending about 3 feet above the ground. He fashioned a simple, hooded cap for it to keep out rain and snow. This was the intake. Now here's what made this actually brilliant. Air would be drawn into the hooded cap. It would travel down 10 feet into the base of the cellar. Then it would have to travel the full 15-foot length of the cellar through the main culvert pipe before entering the cabin and feeding the stove. That air, which might be 30 below zero at the surface, would spend a crucial amount of time surrounded by the earth. Earth that never freezes. Earth that holds a steady 45 or 50 degrees. The ground itself would act as a giant, free preheater. He explained the principle to Eleanor one evening. "The stove needs to breathe," he said, sketching it on a piece of scrap wood. "Right now, it's breathing minus 20-degree air. It wastes half its wood just heating that air up to the point of combustion. I'm going to let it breathe 45-degree air. The earth will warm it for us." She looked at the massive hole, the strange pipes. She heard the whispers from town. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." He just nodded, wiping grease from his hands. "Let them." He finished the work in late September. He backfilled the entire structure, packing the earth down tight until all that was visible was a low, gentle mound of earth and the strange capped pipe sticking out of the ground like a crooked chimney. From the outside, it looked like he'd built a buried shed. Inside the cabin, all you could see was a small grated opening in the floor behind the stove, connected to that hidden pipe. Total cost, under $30. The $7 for the pipe, some blasting powder for stubborn rock, and the rest was his own labor and stone from his own land. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with quiet observation. Neighbors would ride past, slow their horses, and just stare at the mound of earth and the odd pipe. They'd shake their heads and ride on. The gossip network of the frontier was ruthlessly efficient. It flowed through the trading post, the church social, the quilting circle. The first direct confrontation came from the man who was supposed to know best, Calvin Dreeker. Drecker ran the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley, including his own. He was a practical, respected man whose professional identity was tied to doing things the right way. He stopped by one afternoon in October, ostensibly to talk about lumber prices, but Arthur knew why he was there. Drecker walked around the mound, kicking at the dirt. He squinted at the intake vent. He came back to the porch, where Arthur was sharpening an axe. "Arthur," he began not unkindly, "I need to ask what in God's name you're doing." Arthur kept his motion steady, drawing the file over the steel. "Just trying something different with the stove intake." Drecker shook his head, a look of genuine concern on his face. "Son, I've been building in this valley for 30 years. You can't pipe underground air into a house. The damp will kill you. Everything you own will be covered in mold by Christmas. Your firewood will rot. Your flour will spoil. You're inviting the wet deep into your home." It was a technical, specific objection. It sounded perfectly reasonable. Arthur stopped his work and looked at him. His response was calm and so short it was almost dismissive. "I put in a gravel bed for drainage. It'll be bone dry." Drecker was clearly frustrated. He was trying to offer the wisdom of experience, and this newcomer was ignoring it. "It's your family, Arthur, but I've seen mistakes like this cost people everything." He left, and the word he spread wasn't malicious, but it was damaging. Arthur Croft, the Englishman, was a fool who was going to make his family sick with rot. The public insult came a week later at the trading post. A burly teamster named Hank Gable, a man known for his loud voice and cruel humor, saw Arthur loading sacks of flour. In a voice loud enough for the whole store to hear, he bellowed, "Heard you're digging your own grave to stay warm this winter, Croft. Saves the rest of us the trouble in the spring." A few men laughed nervously. Arthur didn't turn around. He paid for his flour, loaded his wagon, and left. He never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction, but the nickname stuck. Behind his back, he was Gopher Croft. The pressure on Eleanor was different, quieter, but just as sharp. At the weekly quilting circle, the other women would ask her, with tones of pitying concern, if she was feeling all right in the cabin. They'd talk about the importance of good, dry air and trade stories about families who got lung sickness from damp homes. The conversations would go quiet when she approached. She was the fool's wife. She felt the isolation keenly. One evening, her brother Thomas, who had a ranch 10 miles down the valley, came for a visit. He was a good man, but he was a man who cared what people thought. They sat at the table after the girls were asleep. "Arthur," Thomas said, turning his hat in his hands, "Eleanor is my sister. I have to say something. People are talking. They're not just saying you're eccentric. They're saying you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. That you don't know how to build a proper cabin, so you're trying to burrow into the ground like an animal to hide from the cold. The words, framed as concern, cut deeper than any public mockery. It was an attack on his competence, his manhood. Eleanor looked at her husband, her eyes pleading with him to defend himself, to explain. Arthur just looked at his brother-in-law, his face calm. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," he said, his voice level. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." The final seal of official disapproval came from Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent. He was an institutional skeptic, a man who operated by the book. He'd heard the rumors and came to inspect what he assumed was a root cellar for storing potatoes. He walked around the mound, took notes, and consulted a government pamphlet. "Mr. Croft," he said formally, "this design is unorthodox. For proper vegetable storage, you need better ventilation to prevent rot. This single intake isn't in any manual I've seen. I'm afraid you'll lose your whole crop." Arthur didn't bother to correct him. He didn't say it had nothing to do with vegetables. He just nodded. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Abernathy." By November, not one person in the valley thought Arthur Croft had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own foolishness, a damp, useless hole that invited mold into his house and ridicule onto his family. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Arthur right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then January came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1905 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as the Great Freeze. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. A vast stationary dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the northern Rockies and refused to move. It started on January 5th. The temperature dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, normal for a Montana winter. No one was worried. By January 8th, it was -18 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind began to pick up. January 12th, the thermometer at the trading post read -31 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Wind chills were approaching -60 degrees Fahrenheit. January 14th, it hit -38 degrees Fahrenheit. And it stayed there. For 9 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never climbed above 20 below zero. The wind was relentless, a steady, keening force from the north that drove the snow into drifts as high as houses and stripped the heat from everything it touched. This was the test. The community began to suffer. The suffering was specific and measurable. Calvin Drecker, the master builder, was burning through a cord of his best seasoned oak every 5 days. His well-built house was holding a grim 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He had his family living in 2 rooms, the rest of the house closed off. Eleanor's brother, Thomas, had a larger ranch house. It was a sieve in the wind. He was burning wood so fast he ran out of seasoned logs and had to start cutting green aspen, which sizzled and steamed and gave off almost no heat. His children were sick, coughing in the frigid air of their own home. The Colby Ranch, the biggest in the area, was burning 2 cords a month. Their cattle started dying, freezing to death in the lean-to shelters that had been sufficient for 30 years. The teamster, Hank Gable, the man who had mocked Arthur, had a chimney fire from burning too hot for too long. He and his family were forced to shelter with neighbors, their cabin a frozen, smoke-damaged shell. People were getting desperate. They were burning fence posts. They were burning furniture. Wood piles that were supposed to last until March were gone by mid-January. The simple act of survival became a full-time, exhausting job. Feeding the fire, fighting the drafts, trying to keep water from freezing solid indoors. And then people started noticing the Croft place. The first thing they noticed was the smoke, or rather, the lack of it. From every other chimney in the valley, thick plumes of wood smoke poured out day and night, a sign of fires being pushed to their absolute limit. From Arthur Croft's chimney, there was only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke, the kind you'd see on a mild autumn day. It was impossible. It made no sense. Then, on the fourth day of the deep freeze, with the temperature at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, Calvin Drecker was riding a sledge with an emergency load of wood for a neighbor when he passed Arthur's cabin. He saw Arthur outside in his shirt sleeves, splitting wood. Not frantically, but with a calm, steady rhythm. He wasn't wearing a heavy coat. He wasn't wearing a hat. He worked for 10 minutes, then calmly stacked the wood and went back inside. Drecker just stopped his horse and stared. It was like looking at a man in a different season. It was so profoundly wrong, so contrary to the brutal reality of the cold, that for a moment he thought he might be hallucinating. The story spread. The thin smoke, the man in shirt sleeves. What was happening in that cabin? Was it a miracle or a lie? No one knew. But in the midst of their own shivering misery, the strange little cabin with the mound of earth beside it became an object of intense, desperate curiosity. If you're still here, stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It established a new law of survival. The breaking point for Calvin Drecker came on January 16th, the 8th day of the freeze. The temperature outside his home was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, before wind chill. Inside, despite burning wood at a terrifying rate, it was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife was trying to make soup, but the water was taking forever to boil. His children were bundled in so many layers they could barely move. He was a master builder, and he was failing. He was losing. He thought of Arthur Croft in his shirt sleeves. The memory gnawed at him. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He told his wife he was going to check on the Crofts. It was a lie of omission. He wasn't going to check on them. He was going to see for himself what was happening. He loaded a few logs onto his sledge as a pretext, an offering. He arrived at the Croft cabin and knocked. The door was opened by Eleanor. And the first thing that happened was the vindication. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A wave of warmth washed over him. It hit him like stepping into a different season. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove. It was a steady, comfortable, radiant warmth. He was so stunned he couldn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, letting the feeling soak into his frozen face. "Calvin," Eleanor said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" He found his voice. "Everything's fine, Eleanor. I brought some extra wood, just in case." He gestured vaguely at the sledge. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Drecker saw the image that would be burned into his memory forever. The two Croft girls, Clara and Rose, were sitting at the small wooden table. They were doing their lessons on a slate, and they were wearing simple cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets, dresses. His own children were practically immobilized in wool and canvas. These children were living in a different world. "We're managing fine, Calvin. But thank you," Eleanor said, her voice holding a new, quiet confidence. "Please come in out of the cold." He stepped inside. The air was warm, and to his astonishment, it was dry. There was no hint of damp, no smell of mold. It smelled of baking bread and clean wood smoke. He looked at the stove. It was ticking over gently, the damper halfway closed. It wasn't roaring. It wasn't being pushed. How much wood are you burning, Arthur?" Drecker asked, his voice rough. Arthur looked up from a book he was reading by the fire. "Oh, about a cord every 2 weeks, maybe a little less." Let that sink in for a moment. Drecker was burning a cord every 5 days just to keep his house at 40 degrees. Thomas was burning even more. Arthur was using less than a third of the wood, and the result was this impossible comfort. Drecker, a man who believed in what he could see and measure, walked to the small wall thermometer next to the door. He squinted at it. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees, while outside it was minus 41. A difference of 109 degrees. This was the impossible number. It defied every law of frontier life he had ever known. He looked from the thermometer to the calm, gently burning stove, to the children in their dresses. He couldn't reconcile it. "How?" he finally whispered. Arthur didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stood up and pointed to the small grate in the floor behind the stove. "The stove breathes from the cellar. The earth warms the air first." Drecker knelt down. Arthur opened the grate. A gentle, continuous flow of air could be felt coming up. Drecker put his hand over it. The air wasn't cold. It felt cool, but not frigid. It was astounding. This was the engine, this simple, silent, invisible flow of pre-warmed air. He stood up, shaking his head slowly. He looked at Arthur Croft, this quiet Englishman he had dismissed as a fool. He saw a man who had not tried to fight the cold with more wood and thicker walls, but who had outthought it with a principle. He stayed for another 20 minutes. He checked the walls, bone dry. He looked at the firewood in the box next to the stove, bone dry. Every one of his confident, expert predictions had been wrong, irrefutably wrong. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and turned back to Arthur. He was a proud man, and the words came hard, but they came with the force of undeniable truth. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of revelation, "we've been doing this wrong, all of us, for 50 years. That was the moment. The quiet, terse admission from the valley's foremost expert. The vindication wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was a quiet, factual surrender to a better idea. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity. In the Croft cabin, life continued with a normal rhythm. Children did schoolwork without shivering. Eleanor cooked and sewed in normal clothes. They slept soundly through the night, not waking to a freezing house that required a frantic stoking of the fire. Arthur's system had turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. Word of Calvin Draker's visit spread faster than the cold. His terse admission was more powerful than 1,000 boasts from Arthur. It was an expert's endorsement. 2 days later, after the freeze finally broke, Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, returned. This time, he wasn't carrying pamphlets on root cellars. He was carrying a calibrated, professional thermometer. He came not as a skeptic, but as a documenter. He measured the outside temperature. He measured the inside temperature. Then he measured the temperature of the air coming out of the intake pipe in the cellar. The outside air was -5 degrees Fahrenheit. The air in the cellar, 6 feet from the intake, was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The air coming into the cabin at the stove grate was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. A 49-degree rise, accomplished for free by the silent, constant heat of the earth. Abernathy scribbled furiously in his notebook. He hadn't come to inspect a failed cellar. He had stumbled upon a revolutionary heating system. He discovered that Arthur, the methodical engineer, had kept meticulous records through the entire freeze. A small logbook detailed the date, the high and low outdoor temperature, the indoor temperature, and the approximate amount of wood consumed each day. This wasn't luck, it was data. By the end of January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at the Croft place. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a grudging, then eager respect. The era of the Gopher Croft was over. The first convert was Eleanor's brother, Thomas. He came to Arthur in February, humbled and exhausted from the winter. He had lost 3 head of cattle, and his son had been sick for a month. "Arthur," he said, "I was a fool. Can you show me how you did it?" Arthur didn't hesitate. He spent a full day with Thomas, sketching the design, explaining the principles of drainage, airflow, and depth. Thomas didn't have access to ceramic pipes, so they improvised with a square-sectioned wooden trunk, carefully built from cedar and sealed with pine tar. It was a simpler, cruder version, but it was based on the same correct principle. Thomas and his sons spent that summer building their own earth lung next to their ranch house. By that summer, the tide had fully turned. Calvin Drecker, far from being embarrassed, became Arthur's biggest advocate. When a new family was building a cabin, Drecker would tell them, "First, go talk to Arthur Croft about where to put your stove. Don't make the same mistakes we did." He started incorporating a simplified version of the geothermal intake into his own new cabin designs. The adoption was steady, driven by memory of the Great Freeze. 7 families built systems that summer, 12 more the following year. By 1908, nearly 20 cabins in the valley had some form of geothermal air intake. They became known simply as Croft Cellars. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, published a bulletin the next year through the State Agricultural College. It was titled Subterranean Air Preheating for Domicile Stoves. It was dry and academic, but it contained Arthur's data, diagrams of his system, and Abernathy's own temperature verifications. The bulletin spread the idea beyond the valley to other cold climate communities in Wyoming, the Dakotas, and even up into Canada. Variations emerged. Some used metal stovepipe, some used rock-lined trenches, but the core idea was the same. What Arthur Croft built in 1904 anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call an earth tube or a geothermal heat exchanger. He wasn't an inventor, he was a brilliant adapter. He took a principle he learned 1,000 feet underground in a Cornish tin mine and applied it to keeping his family safe on the American frontier. Years later, when his daughters were grown and the valley was a different place, a young newspaper reporter came to interview the now elderly Arthur about his famous innovation. He asked Arthur if he felt proud of having revolutionized winter survival. Arthur, a man who had remained as terse and humble as ever, just shook his head. He looked out at the mountains. "This isn't new," he said. "It's just correct. The earth was always there, waiting to help. People just had to stop fighting and start listening." The original Croft cellar is still there. The cabin is gone, but the stone arch of the cellar roof holds firm, covered by a century of grass. The intake pipe still stands, a quiet monument to a man who listened to the earth. His story is a powerful reminder. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for its own sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded observation. It rewarded the quiet competence of a man who endured the mockery of his peers, not out of pride, but out of a simple, powerful motivation, the desire to keep his family warm. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And for more stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity, be sure to subscribe. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival techniques. The specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictional, but the engineering and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science.